We are recording the session today so that if you want to watch it later, or for those of you who are even more confused about the time than I am, the recording will be there. There's a link to download the slides in the chat window. If you requested a certificate of participation, you will get that automatically. We check the attendee records and match that up against who requested it. Give us a week or so to get those out to you. So if you don't see it by middle of next week, certainly let us know. Questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the Q&A or into the chat window. Either way will work. So this picture seemed to capture what we've been hearing from parents throughout the spring during online learning. Kids who aren't engaged, parents who are frustrated by changing expectations, by trying to step in a role they never planned to fill, and by what they have learned about their children's academic achievement or lack thereof, and learning struggles that they didn't previously understand. Maybe by the end of this webinar, we'll want to choose a different image, and you can help me decide then. So here's the path we're going to try to follow today, starting with taking a look at what has happened to learning so far in the time of COVID. And then we'll consider whether the current situation is best understood as helping students catch up to where they would have been, or whether there's really a greater opportunity at this time, which is many times a crisis is full of opportunity as well. And to do that, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about what learning is from a neuroscience perspective, and then use that to highlight a couple of principles that I think are particularly worthwhile of giving special emphasis during these challenging times. So the big question on everyone's mind is, what will school look like? In person, remote, hybrid, what days, what hours, what expectations, what technology, what tools? And so what I'd like to do is do a short poll, which I'm going to launch right now. And just to get a little bit of a sense of who's on our webinar at this point today, and who sort of what your perspective is. So if you would go ahead and click on the appropriate link that describes you best, and then how you expect learning to be, and instruction to be taking place this school year. Okay, so it looks like we've got pretty much everybody's answered, and I'm going to end the polling. So we have a bunch of teachers and parents. So teachers who are dealing with the fact that they're teaching, but also the fact that they have students in their home, children who have to be participating in school. And the predominant response, I'm going to share these results, sorry, is remote learning. And that's pretty consistent with the other divided, fewest in person, and then about a quarter of the group indicating that the instruction in school will be hybrid this year. So that's, this has been a moving target, of course, as everybody knows. What all of the reporting and our own conversations with parents tell us is that parents are concerned and stressed no matter what that option is going to look like. They don't feel very well equipped to manage their children's education at home, but also very trepidatious about sending them into a situation where they are uncertain about the potential for some pretty high consequence health impact, not just for the children, but for those at home that the children might be bringing COVID or whatever back to. And of course, teachers are struggling with the same issues. And when you're both, then of course you may have very, very mixed feelings about it. Preferences are changing a lot. Back in May, most parents were still hoping for full-time in-person. Now parents are just about evenly divided among their preference for full-time in-person, hybrid, or full-time remote. And really the landscape is changing day to day. I suspect when this survey gets repeated, this is a survey from Gallup, I expect they'll probably repeat it in another month or two, and we may see something altogether different then. Most children, as it was reflected in the little quick survey we did, the little poll, it appears we're going to be starting school in front of a computer screen, or at least not in a classroom, with some form of remote learning for the vast majority of students. And exactly what that looks like is still, of course, not entirely clear. The expectations for remote learning in the spring, after COVID hit and virtually all schools shifted to remote instruction, varied widely. This study by the American Institutes for Research shows average instruction time of basically 2 to 4 hours a day from kindergarten up through 12th grade, but with quite a lot of variability around those averages. And also a lot of variability in the nature of the instruction, whether it was digital or paper-based, and whether the instruction focused on review or focused on new material. So a lot of factors going into. I talked to one mother this morning in Arlington, Virginia, where the schools apparently simply canceled instruction altogether after COVID hit, and there was zero instruction going on for the fourth quarter of the year. Now, whenever you see charts like this, the focus seems to be on the hours of instruction compared to normal or compared to whatever state requirements there are. But it still really doesn't answer the question about the kind and quality of learning that was taking place and what is now called the COVID slide, which is the amount of learning that didn't take place following school shutdowns. At this point, pretty much all we have are estimates, unless you're in an unusual situation. For most students, there was no benchmark testing at the end of the year, so we really don't know where things stand. And it probably hasn't had time in most cases for there to be beginning of the year testing either. So projections like these, this particular set of projections was the Brookings Institution, and based on historical data of the typical summer slide and then projections based on that. This is for math, this particular slide you're looking at. And essentially, again, a big range. For some students, the loss is expected to be minimal. Some probably continue to grow and thrive in remote learning. But for most, that was not the case. And the lowest quartile of students, as low as 25%, may have lost most or all of what they learned in 2019, 2020. And probably for some students, regression exceeded a full year of learning. It applies both to reading and math. Reading, the estimates are that will fare a little bit better than math, but still for significant numbers of students, last year's learning has likely been completely wiped out by the time period and the accessibility or effectiveness of instruction. So what I'd like to do now is to dig into some of the questions that are being discussed by educators right now and challenge whether, as parents and educators, the questions are really the right ones. So we've got this big picture. We're tracking a bunch of data as to what is and what isn't happening in schools. As Ed Week says, just how much students could regress remains a matter of some debate. So again, those are projections and estimates. A lot of focus on how much learning has been lost. And schools and districts, as this quote suggests, are spending a lot of time trying to figure out what that is, what was missed, and how to improve remote instruction to help students catch up and get back on track. And that has a certain intuitive common sense, but I want to ask whether this is really the right question. Here we think it's important to remember what back to previous levels of learning actually means. The unfortunate truth is that the majority of children in the US were not performing at grade level prior to COVID. And many parents came face to face with this truth when they started trying to support their children and their learning this past spring. Many were dismayed and frustrated as they realized that their children were struggling with grade level work and expectations in ways the schools had not communicated. Many were disappointed in their children's performance, knowledge, and levels of skill development. Some were stunned, some were angry. And low as the levels of proficiency are for students on average, let's not forget the most vulnerable groups and those where the gaps are even wider. So these are just over time, the gaps between average performance and for the total population and average performance for students who qualify for the National School Lunch Program, an SLP. So it's a measure of economic disadvantage. And as you can see, those gaps have been persistent over time and are largely unchanged year on year. The same is true for students with disabilities. The gap is in fact wider than it's been for the last century. And it's narrowed slightly, but it's still substantial for English language learners. Now, there are also plenty of analyses available to give some indication of not just the economic or the educational impact or projections of the educational impact, but actually of the economic impact that's associated with the educational losses from COVID. This is an analysis by McKinsey that sums up the societal level impact on economics based on different instructional formats and based on different points in time at which students may return to the full classroom situation. So you can have this and you also have it in your slides, but basically if it takes a year from now for students to get back into the classroom, the drain on the nation's economy, gross domestic product, GDP, is estimated to be in the range of about $200 billion. That's a big number for sure. But it's dwarfed by the impact of the economic impact of the long-standing educational achievement gaps on the economy. So this is an OECD study, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and an international think tank and consulting organization, research organization. This study done pre-COVID estimated that the US economy would gain $72 trillion if average student performance reached the minimum level of proficiency. That is, if students were actually performing at grade level. So year after year, the US economy could have been bigger by $72 trillion. And in this context, the COVID impact is actually very small. It's less than 1% of the potential of solving the bigger problem. So perhaps the real question we should be asking at this time is how to address the true learning needs of students, not just so that we can return to normal, but how do we rethink education with a real focus on learning to resolve these really long-standing issues, not just how close we can get to pre-COVID education. Now, some of this may actually already be happening. The Learning Council is a research organization focused on educational technology and how it supports transformation in schools. What they observe are changes accelerating, and those changes affect just about everything in education, from the roles of parents and teachers, to the content of education, to the structure and delivery of instruction, the role of teachers moving from the source of the knowledge and imparting it to students to really facilitating learning, supporting learning, keeping track of what students know and what they can do, and helping them figure out how to get where they want to go. Mastering every single part of you. That is not just mastering a bunch of reading curriculum or social studies curriculum or math or science curriculum, but really every aspect of an individual child as a human being. More personalization, more partnering, more connection across geographies and nationalities, In other words, it's really, according to this analysis and this perspective, changing a lot of things. And if every thing is changing, it seems like a really good time to revisit learning, to what we know about neuroscience and educational research about what delivers deep and enduring learning. So I want to take a few minutes just to refresh our understanding of that. If we're going to rethink learning in a new time, in this time of COVID, I think it's essential to remind ourselves what learning actually is, which is a biological process. Learning is what our brains do. Our brains are learning machines. And from a biological point of view, learning is the creation and strengthening of connections among neurons. Our brains build themselves through experience, through interaction with the world. They're not just a vessel or a container to pour a bunch of content into. They actually have to construct and build the neural networks that will reflect what the world is exposing them to. So when we see or hear something, a group of neurons is activated together. And the more that that group of neurons activates together, the more likely activating part of that network will cause the others to activate across that network. And that's really the essence of learning, the principle that neuroscientists refer to as neurons that fire together, wire together. Memory then is not pulling information out of a storage vault of some kind. It's actually reactivating those neural networks in our brains. So if they haven't been sufficiently activated and learning hasn't really happened, there's nothing to activate. You get to the test and nothing happens. If you get to the test or you get to a situation where you need that information and it's been learned well and there's a network that is primed to respond, then we can retrieve that information. The more we activate a network of neurons, the stronger it gets. So in a very real sense, our brains become what our brains do. So think about that in the context of remote learning and the experiences that our children are having these days. Our job as parents and teachers is really to help our students' brains build strong connections for the information and skills that they will need to reactivate that learning later, for the test or for real life, or for, and most importantly, of course, for real life, ultimately. We don't educate our children to be really good at school, we educate them to be successful in life. I just want to jump down to the cellular level for a minute and do a little review of neurons. This is a diagram of 3 neurons, and each neuron has a nucleus, which you can see that black dot in the center, and 1 axon. The axon is the part of the neuron that carries electrical and chemical messages from that neuron to other neurons. And the dendrites, that's all those other things poking out from the outside of the neuron, those are dendrites. Those are the parts of the neuron that receive the messages. Every neuron has approximately 6,000 dendrites, but just 1 axon. And dendrites come from the Greek word for tree, so it's sort of like the branches of a tree. So the neuron will send the electrical signal down the axon, and the space where it connects, and there can be multiple connections at the end of the axon, of course, but the space where it connects, that linkage between 2 neurons, is called the synapse. And the synapse is where the electrical signal becomes a chemical one, and that it triggers the release of neurochemicals into that space between the 2 neurons. So neurons talking to each other through these chemical messages, the neurotransmitters in the synapse, are what accounts for all of human behavior. This is an actual slide of brain tissue enlarged many times. You could fit 30,000 neurons on the head of a pin, but here you can see the little black cell bodies and then all of the connections, all of the dendrites and axons connecting those neurons to each other up and down through different layers of the cortex. The cortex is the outer layer of the brain. So imagine all of these neurons activating, transmitting signals electronically over and over again to activate or calm other neurons. So our brains are a very busy place. But our brains don't start off like this. Here are two more images of brain tissue from the cortex, one from a newborn and the second on the right from a 2-year-old. So at birth, our brains have approximately 85 billion neurons and weigh about a pound. As adults, we also have 85 billion neurons, but our brains weigh more. By a year, the brain has doubled in size, and by age 5 or 6, it's 90% of its adult size and weight. What's important to understand here, and what you can see pretty vividly in these images, is that the brain is not creating additional neurons. That incredible growth in size and weight reflects the creation of connections among the neurons, their ability to network in and to connect in networks that will activate together in response to various stimuli and activities and behaviors, and which allow us to hear and talk and see and grasp and run and create a work of art, write a novel, understand what our pets are telling us just through their body language. Everything that we do with our brains is embodied in these connections of networks. So in fact, what these slides show very graphically is what happens in the brain when it learns. This is actually a picture of learning. So how does this understanding of learning help us think about learning in the time of COVID? First, it reminds us that each brain is unique and has its own networks into which new learning can be developed. This is a quote from the Brookings Institution regarding the wide variability of learning loss, recognizes this need for differentiation. And while it refers to content, it also includes a tantalizing reference to a broader range of needs. And this is critical. It's not just about content. For years, teachers have delivered content, a lot of the same content in a lot of the same ways with roughly similar results. So perhaps in the time of COVID, it makes it easier, maybe inescapable, to more directly address what this broader range of needs might be. So I want to look at a couple of aspects of learning that I believe take on new salience in the current environment. These were always important, even critical. But without focusing on these in the time of COVID, my belief is that we have little hope of fulfilling the educational needs of this generation. And those two areas are emotions and cognitive skills, in which we include executive functions. So, emotions first. Social emotional learning has become more prominent in education over the last several years and is a top concern for many teachers and students as we return to school this year. In the Portland Public Schools, for example, where my son is a freshman English teacher, the first 2 weeks of the term are going to be dedicated to attending to students' emotional well-being and to actually using an SEL curriculum. And that's consistent with all the kinds of emotional issues that students and teachers and parents and all of us have been dealing with throughout the spring and summer. The focus here is on helping students deal with negative emotions, the kind of emotions that impede learning: loneliness, depression, fear, anxiety, sadness, anger. You can probably extend that list and probably are familiar with them, or maybe even just experiencing some of them. Certainly, you know your students are experiencing them. And all of this basically explains why educators have such a vested interest in helping students cope with these. Simply stated, these emotions, negative emotions, stress, and other negative emotions impair learning. They trigger a fight or flight response. They redirect our metabolic resources away from the thinking parts of our brains. Emotion overrides cognition. Learning doesn't happen or happen well when students are stressed or afraid or feeling other negative emotions. And so realizing that this is even more so than it is in normal times makes it very sensible that we would be paying more attention to that than we have in the past. But there's another side to emotions, and the potential to rethink some aspects of education should also get some focus here. It's not just about comfort and safety and resilience. Emotions are also critical for learning. So they can impede or they can enhance. Just because we want to minimize negative emotions doesn't mean we want to avoid emotions altogether. In fact, emotions are essential. Adrenaline isn't just a stress response. The right amount of it actually creates stronger memory. Engaging emotional and motivational interest, and you naturally engage adrenaline, you get stronger memories as a result of that. So we hear from a lot of parents and teachers about motivation and engagement. A lot of families struggled with this past spring. And it's vital that we also help students use the engagement and motivation systems in their brains for learning. Last Saturday, I was on a Zoom call, yes, even on Saturday, but this was special because it was with a group of colleagues called the Brainy Bunch. And the Brainy Bunch was founded by Pat Wolf. Many of you may know of Pat Wolf. She is one of the pioneers of applying neuroscience research to learning and teaching, author of a book called Brain Matters, which you should read if you haven't. So I asked this question of this group as well. You know, how would we as a group of experts in applying neuroscience to education suggest to parents and teachers that this reinventing of education for learning, you know, what should be focusing on? And it turned out that many in the Brady Bunch group were working in areas related to motivation and to the importance of helping students connect with their own sense of purpose, a passion for accomplishing or doing or affecting or correcting or changing something. One member of the group talked about the emotion we call awe. Think about this. When is the last time you felt awe? Or that one of your students did? If we did nothing else during this time of reinvention and redoing than helping every student find something to be passionate about, to be motivated to work on, simply because they felt driven to do so because it gives them purpose, perhaps much of the rest of what we feel they need to learn would be much easier. To say nothing of the fact that our communities are full of issues that need new thinking and new energy. So my generation is not going to solve all of them. I'd like to see my children and grandchildren feel the passion to resolve them and to learn and find ways to do that. Commas and arithmetic make a whole lot more sense in the context of a cause, something you believe in, something you're trying to accomplish. So think about opportunities you have to help your children or students discover their purpose. There's some emerging curricula for this. Project Wayfinder is one, but this can be done simply by letting groups of students find things they care about and learn through the process. I have heard stories about a group of boys who were kayaking off the California coast near Pebble Beach and discovered a huge supply of golf balls and realized that, of course, they were coming from the golf course, and that tried to figure out how many golf balls and how much pollution had actually ended up in the ocean as a result of probably people who golf like I do, golfing on that course, or having wind blow their ball over, you know, which gave way to petitioning and presenting and urging new options for the golf course at Pebble Beach, which eventually happened. Groups of students who got involved in political redistricting, groups of students who discovered that they wanted to influence the number and location of the water fountains. There are issues and concerns that kids have, and if they believe that they have some ability to impact it, it's a concept also called agency, it gives them a tremendous motivation and energy to do it. to learn what they need to, and to develop the skills to persuade others to help them resolve those issues. The other neuroscience principle or concept that I think needs special attention these days are cognitive skills, the actual infrastructure for learning that our students bring to the learning process. So this chart is one we use to describe what cognitive skills are. And basically up at the top, this is why all of us as parents and as teachers are concerned about our children's education, their ability to learn. We want them to get as far as they can academically. We want them to have a good job to support them and their families and that satisfies them. We want them to be healthy and good contributors to society. And in school, the content part or the standards part or the parts that we have traditionally measured and focused on in schools are, of course, reading and writing and math and science, increasingly social and emotional learning. But the infrastructure for learning, the actual processes that our brains use to take in, store, retrieve, and manage information all sit underneath this. It starts with things you can see in the foundational skills box down at the bottom, things like attention and visual processing and processing speed, auditory processing, some of our very short-term memory skills. The next box up contains a group of cognitive skills that are called executive functions, working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. And of course, there are higher order executive functions, which are the higher order kinds of thinking that we're increasingly wanting, and that certainly our workplaces that are going to eventually employ the students that graduate from our educational institutions and processes are going to demand. And the important thing to understand here is that these are not just nice to have along the side. They're actually part and parcel. They're integral to learning to read and learning to do math. So, for example, we can't just build strong readers by teaching reading, because the basics of reading aren't what most educators assume they are. Most educators, if I ask them, would say that the basics of reading are something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And those are important things. We can't be good readers without them, but they're not the most basic. There isn't a decoding part of our brain. There are a bunch of systems and processes, cognitive skills, that are necessary in order for decoding to happen, and they have to be working together. The same is true of fluency. Things like visual span, or how much information we can take in at a glance, or our flexible attention, our processing speed, are going to impact fluency. And when it comes to comprehension, of course, things like working memory and visualization are critical and probably account for the reason that many students, even when they manage to get through, be able to sound out words, they get through the decoding step and they get through and build up a reasonable amount of fluency, still struggle with comprehension, because comprehension requires the integration of a lot of skills and the use of a substantial amount of working memory and visualization, but working memory in particular. If you think about what's happening when you're reading, you're taking in pieces of information, you're holding them in your mind. That's the definition of working memory, the ability to hold information in your mind while you think about it. And that's the only way we can comprehend. Working memory is our conscious processing. And so without that, or without a sufficient capacity there, comprehension is going to be pretty problematic. We use many of these same skills for math. They manifest themselves in a little bit different ways sometimes. And we can think about them in terms of, a lot of the sort of stages of, of levels of arithmetic and math that we traditionally go through in terms of from elementary up through higher education is starting with basic things like counting and operations, which also require things like sequential processing or selective attention. Working memory, again, you have to keep track of what you counted and what you haven't. When we come to problem solving, cognitive flexibility, verbal reasoning, and other kinds of reasoning often come into play. And then strong connections between spatial memory, visualization, abstract reasoning with the kinds of problems that we need to address in geometry and calculus. So if these skills are working efficiently and accurately, that's great. We can bring all of that cognitive infrastructure and foundation to the learning process. Without it, we're going to struggle mightily with all these things. So here again, I want to use the discussion in the education media to make a point. Diagnostic tests are also sometimes called formative tests, are supposed to help teachers understand where students are and what they need to learn next. However, most formative tests are about the what, the content, not about the how. And so they don't necessarily help teachers or parents understand how to help students learn whatever the content and the skills are. What parents and teachers really need to know is how their students and children learn, what their learning infrastructure is. Without that kind of diagnosis, it's sort of like making a diagnosis of COVID based on your weight. You're making a diagnosis of how to provide a learning experience without knowing really anything about the learning experience and infrastructure of the child. So what I want to do next is take a look at a cognitive profile of just a few students to sort of talk a little bit about what this type of diagnostic testing could provide. So this is the cognitive profile of a 13-year-old girl. You're seeing her strengths on the bottom left, skills to support on the bottom right. Of course, you're not going to see reading or math or anything else here. These are cognitive processes. This student has good nonverbal reasoning skills, so abstract reasoning, spatial perception, comfortably in that expected range, but very low. In fact, that little filled in box next to it means that her verbal reasoning score is in the bottom 5% of the population. So if you know that, I want those of you who can think about some students maybe who had poor verbal processing and also maybe poor attention and processing speed. What would you expect if you gave this student a task of writing out sentences using new vocabulary words, that is, using verbal reasoning skills, and you did it on a timed test? What do you think would happen? What do you think would happen, however, if the student were given extra time and asked to create visual images of vocabulary words to help her learn them? Far better result. This is the profile of a 10-year-old boy. Unlike the last profile, this student struggles with spatial reasoning, but has good verbal reasoning. If this student gets stuck trying to interpret a chart or a graph or a geometry problem, what kind of strategies would be most helpful? We wouldn't even ask that question if we didn't know about this child's cognitive profile. And this student is very different from the other two. Issues with attention and probably some impulsivity, I could tell you that was the case, which is part of a lack of inhibitory control, again, executive functions. So in this case, its executive functions are at the heart of the academic performance problems. And he may perform very inconsistently in learning different types of material simply because his verbal memory, which you see in the high and the expected range, is so much stronger than his visual memory, which is low in the expected range. So if we can't identify these cognitive strengths and weaknesses, the way our children learn, our instruction is going to be inefficient at best and certainly impede learning or enhance it, depending on whether we are lucky enough to find a match. But the point is, we don't have to just count on luck. We can actually address this much more directly, and we can understand it and use that information. Another Another quote from the Education Press. Education Week probably didn't have cognitive skills in mind when they talked about foundational skills and content here, when it suggested that teachers just give that information to parents and ask them to focus on those skills at home. So as a parent, if your child's teacher said to you, your child's foundation for learning is weak in verbal reasoning, or in attention, or in visual memory, how would you focus on those skills at home? Your child's teacher probably can't even tell you how to do this, but it can absolutely be done. With the kind of cognitive assessment that we've been talking about, and the right kind of cognitive training, students' foundational cognitive skills can be strengthened. And this, all by itself, can have a dramatic impact on academic performance. So this is just a quick example of one of the students I just showed you. And what you're seeing here is her percentile ranking on an initial test and then a second test right after 12 weeks of cognitive training. And so what you can see here is most skills experiencing a really substantial improvement. Attention going from the 37th to the 57th percentile. Visual memory going from the 40th to the 93rd percentile. Abstract reasoning going from the 35th percentile to basically what's gifted. These skills are malleable, they're built, they can change, just the way that we build skills and learning through neural networks. These are the operating systems of our brain, and we can strengthen them too. Now let's look at how those creases in cognitive skills translate to performance on academic measures. This particular study was done with students with specific learning disabilities. The pre and the post test in this case was the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery. And what it's translated into is a proficiency index. So a normally developing student would score on these tests at 90% proficiency. And you can see the light blue and the light green bar for the control group and the brainware group. They used brainware Safari cognitive training software. We're in the 63-64% range. So much lower than 90%. And look at the reading scores. Now, not much change, no cognitive growth for the students who were in the control group, but getting their standard math and reading interventions that they were entitled to in their school. But they, of course, experienced, as most of you have experienced, small incremental improvements with a tremendous amount of work on those interventions. But the group that had actually experienced cognitive training saw these dramatic spurts in their growth in both reading and math. A full grade equivalent in reading or 8/10 of a grade equivalent in reading and a full grade equivalent in math. And remember, that's in 12 weeks. So not even a full year, actually just part of a school year. Here's some other results from a study of 4th and 5th grade students where cognitive training was implemented specifically to see its impact on reading. These first scores were some of the underlying sort of diagnostic Woodcock-Johnson scores, and the pre and the post tests in this case were just 10 weeks apart, with the cognitive training taking place in between. So 2 to 3.5 grade equivalents improvement in about a quarter of a school year. And then this chart shows this school system used Fontes and Pinnell reading levels. And basically what this does is that students are expected to gain about 5 reading levels over the course of the year. So the expected gain over the span of these students' cognitive training would be 1.5 grade levels, 1.5 reading levels. Of the 20 students, only 2 did not gain additional reading levels, and that was because they were already performing at the highest reading level. Of the other students who weren't, the average was actually 4.5 grade levels in 10 weeks. So many times the number of grade level or reading level improvements that would be expected during that time frame. So if we want to talk, whether we can talk about catching them up, or we can accelerating and really helping children overcome and perform at grade level without building this cognitive infrastructure. It's a tremendous amount of difficulty and a tremendous amount of work. When we do that, we give them the capacity to be far more successful, far more rapidly. So now I'd like to see, and what I want to do too is if there's some of you who are just joining us because I got my time switched up, and there were some other people who managed to do the same thing. So we started talking at 2 o'clock instead of 3 o'clock. We're coming up to, we're about 10 minutes prior to 3 o'clock. And so if you are just joining us, don't think that you got your time wrong. It was we that got our time wrong. There's a number of us. And I'm going to repeat this webinar starting at 3 o'clock. So hang in with us. I probably should do that in the chat window. Karen, if you happen to have joined us, and if you could actually type that information in the chat window, I would be so appreciative. So I want to see what kinds of questions have come up. Hopefully there's some things in the chat window. What I want to do is also, while we're doing that, you can let me know which picture you think will be the best representation of learning in the time of COVID. So I'm going to check go in the chat window. Okay, so I'm going to repaste the link to the slides. Okay, so if you joined recently, if you joined the webinar just in the last few minutes or after our initial sort of introduction, you may not have been able to see the link to the slides. So I've just posted that again, and we'll also include it when we send out the follow-up information to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to do that. So hopefully you've seen that. Please feel free to type any questions, thoughts, reactions, anything you'd like to share in the chat window. I'm going to just share my contact information. If you're interested and like to continue the conversation, talk about your own family, your own school, your own classroom, your own whatever it happens to be, since we have a variety of people on the webinar today. Okay, Beth has a question, I think. Oh. Beth, if you could type, how about that? Type your question in the chat window, that would be terrific. And again, if you're just joining us, if you've just logged into the webinar and are confused by why you're seeing the closing slide, it's because we actually started the webinar at 2 and are going to repeat it at 3. So hang in there. We'll be getting going again in just a little, about 8 minutes more. So I want to apologize. So I've got a couple of new messages here. Okay. Okay, so a couple of questions. Well, one comment, a child with learning disabilities. I will tell you that we have been talking to a lot of families with children with learning disabilities who have really struggled and continue to struggle with the kinds of supports and help that they really need to be successful in school. I also think it's really important to understand that in most school situations, the kinds of supports that are provided for students with learning disabilities tend to focus on accommodations, adjustments to the curriculum, and strategies, specific strategies, sometimes not so specific, to help them compensate for the areas that are not as strong. Increasingly, what's happening is that schools and parents as well are trying to focus on actually building that infrastructure, strengthening those underlying cognitive skills so that it's not such a struggle. And as you saw in this, some of the research that I shared really briefly, and I'm sorry it was so rushed, it is possible to have a significant impact on those. For those of you who are interested in getting a certificate of participation for the webinar, if you indicated when you registered that you wanted one, you will get that automatically. We will match the attendee list up with those who requested it, and you will get that automatically. So probably it'll be mid next week by the time we are able to get all of them out. So if you don't see it by then, certainly let us know, and we can. So additional resources to focus on activities to build cognitive function. Resources are examples. So building cognitive function has, for many years, really been the purview of clinicians, speech pathologists, vision developmental experts, occupational therapists, and other psychologists, neurologists, other kinds of learning specialists, and therapists. There are now tools. One of them is the one that I shared the data for today. And for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to be starting the webinar again at 3 o'clock. So please stay with us. Is a software program that can be used in schools, and it can also be used, it's also part of programs that are being used at home. So it's flexible in terms of whether, if you're an educator, there's definitely opportunities there. And, you know, there are other, in order to build it in a really significant way, there are a number of criteria that really need to be met by the cognitive training program, that it be comprehensive, that it be integrated, that it be progressively challenging. And the good news is that it's been built into a system now that can be used much more broadly than, and for many more children than it was able to. So please feel free to contact me, or just we'll follow up with those of you who ask these kinds of questions following this, so that we can get you the information that you would need. And then again, it's now about 3 minutes until 3. So for those of you who are just joining us, I got confused with my time, and fortunately I had a whole wonderful group of other who got a little confused about their time too. And so we went ahead and started the webinar at 2, and we're going to start it again in just a couple of minutes, and keep everything going and walk again through what we've been through. So if you're just finishing up, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. If you're just joining us, I want to say hang in there just for a couple more minutes, and we'll be getting started again promptly at 3 o'clock.